You're listening to What Did I Say with Dan Rothenberg.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. I hope you're doing well. I hope you are facing the challenge of connecting with your teenagers and young adults at the same time, having grace while you do it. We're going to start with our parenting tip, and today's parenting tip is about praise. When praising your teenager, keep it specific, concise, and pure. Farm-to-table praise, free of parental additives such as advice or lectures. Great job in your chemistry test. You got a B+. I'm proud of you. Just stop right there. You know what I mean? Like when we add in our own stuff, for instance, hey, if you work a little harder, you might get an A. Or, you see, I told you if you focused, you do well. We tend to take away from the moment, from that victory, and sort of send the message that nothing our kids do is ever quite good enough because we always have to weigh in. We always have to kind of remind them that they could do better. Remember that adolescence is a rebirth, emotionally and hormonally. It's like everything is sensitive. It's all or nothing. So since we're talking about praise, which means they did something well, let's just go all in. Not everything has to be a teaching moment immediately. So for instance, we can wait till tomorrow to remind our kid to practice their foul shots. For today, let's just go with great game, I'm proud of you. Not to mix metaphors, but when thinking about praise, imagine ordering a drink at the bar. Just kind of go with me on this. When it comes to teenagers, they need a shot. You know what I'm talking about? Great job, I'm proud of you. Boom, shot of praise. As parents, we kind of like to make a mixed drink. Take a shot of praise, put it in the blender, mix it with a little advice, maybe a boring story from our childhood. Next thing you know, you got like a lime green, lame parent drink with a bamboo umbrella, and we're like, here you go, honey. And our teenager's like, dude, I didn't order this. Now, kind of a disturbing metaphor to use with our underage kids, but maybe if we give them a shot of praise, they won't need a shot of something else. Okay, let's talk about trauma. One of the cool things about a podcast is that it takes shape over time. And my mentor, Greg Barrett, who you might know Greg, he wrote a book called He's Just Not That Into You. Now he has a podcast called Don't Take Bullshit from Fuckers. It's a popular, funny dating podcast. And he listened to my first episode of What Did I Say? And he told me, add in a part where I answer questions, where you guys can weigh in. And so we're going to begin to do that after every interview. I'm going to be a little less long-winded, a little less blah, 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 and focus on you. So email me at whatsayme43@gmail.com. That's WHATSAYME43@gmail.com. Let me know any parenting questions you might have, any suggestions you might have. Again, I'm just kind of starting out here. You might say, Dan, this was helpful, this wasn't so helpful. Anything you have to say or ask, let me know, and we'll talk about it. So this episode, we are focusing on trauma, what to do when our kids experience trauma, and how our own unprocessed trauma can affect our parenting. First of all, I just want to establish a definition of trauma, because sometimes I think we use the term trauma when we shouldn't, and we don't when we should. Like sometimes we might casually say, oh my God, my boss chewed me out, and it was totally traumatizing, and that wasn't actual trauma. And on the other hand, we might experience actual trauma and then downplay it or stuff it down. So what's the distinction between trauma and just a challenging experience? Trauma is defined as an emotional response to a horrible or challenging event. And the important thing is that it sticks with us in our mind and in our body. It doesn't just heal on its own. So trauma provides like a shot to the nervous system or psyche that has the potential to change our fundamental sense of safety or how we see the world. Bottom line, the passage of time in and of itself often doesn't heal trauma. That tends to be the difference between trauma and something really, really difficult that eventually we'll get over. For instance, let's say, hypothetically, that you were dating someone and they were sleeping with other people because you agreed to that because it was the 90s and you were living in San Francisco. But every time it just kind of ripped your heart out. You know what I mean? It was never okay. And finally you realized that you were trying to stay sober, but you were going to drink again because this was so distressing. And so you get up the courage to break up with her and you curl up in the fetal position and you just want to die because you feel like you'll never find love again. But then over time, you just get a little distance from it, you get your legs back, you meet new people, and you do heal, because that's not trauma, that's heartbreak. Fill in the details of your own. Let's take the same scenario, but the relationship ends because you catch that person with your best friend, and then they start dating. That might be a different story. That might not necessarily heal on its own. The experience of witnessing that might shock the nervous system, and your faith and trust in people changes for a long time or maybe forever if you don't find a way to heal it or find people to validate your feelings rather than just saying, oh, forget about it, you're better off without her. Powering through things doesn't work with trauma, and that's the important thing to know when parenting kids that might be going through some trauma. So we've got the big T's, or the big traumas that we've all agreed to: sexual abuse, neglect, physical abuse. But it's also important to keep in mind that things like divorce, bullying, peer exclusion, being told you're overweight and not good enough over and over again, difficulty with a breakup depending on the circumstances, these are the small T's, and our kids might be coming in contact with them. And we want to either find them help or just be able to validate their feelings, not just tell them to power through it, because we're talking about connecting. And when we tell our kids to just kind of get over it, it's no big deal, then you have the trauma plus the guilt and shame they feel because they can't just get over it. To talk more about this, we're going to move on to our interview with Hanika Foster. She's the trauma specialist at Healing Solutions Family Therapy Center, our partnering mental health practice. And by the way, that's Hanukkah, not to be confused with the Jewish holiday of Chanukah. However, her being here today is definitely a gift. And I'm not just talking about like that pair of socks you get on the fourth night. I'm talking about brand new Lego Death Star. Here we go. So I really appreciate you joining me. What I was hoping we could talk about was how you see trauma affect the family, how you see it affect parenting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, it's so interesting because I think so often we forget that as parents, we have so much of our own trauma that's gone unresolved for so long. And then when we have a child who's now experienced trauma, it triggers all of our stuff. And then we don't know what to do. We're like, everybody's so emotionally dysregulated at this point.
What's the difference between trauma and just kind of a rough experience or a disappointment?
I think trauma is something that we experience that then kind of takes a hold of our nervous system. It affects us like completely. We think about it all the time. It affects the way that we basically walk through life. If we experience trauma where it breaks trust, then we're going to experience the inability to trust others all the time. If we experience something that's just like, like I couldn't trust my mom, but I still can manage healthy relationships, then that wasn't a traumatic experience for you. You obviously had enough resilience.
So it's a moment of overload to the emotional and the nervous system, and those things stick with us.
It literally gets stuck in us, not just in our mind, but also in our physical body. Our mental health and our physical health are so interconnected.
And I think the physical reaction, that's what is making parents right now bring a lot of teenagers into therapy. Like, I was an anxious child, but now you see a lot of OCD, you see a lot of panic attacks.
Yes.
Physically.
Teenagers are supposed to be tired and you're supposed to let them take a lot of naps because they're growing and their body's growing and they need that rest. But this is like beyond that. This is like almost to that severe, like depressive state. Like literally I'm going to school and I'm breaking down in the bathroom, having a full-on panic attack in tears, and nobody knows what to do. I've had clients tell me a teacher has called on them and, they didn't know the answer. And then they were a little bit shamed in that. And then they felt shame, they felt embarrassed. And then now they have trouble even speaking up there.
And if I could kind of channel the frustrated parent right now. Okay, so in other words, everything's trauma. Come on. When I was that age, I got called on, I powered through it.
Not everything is trauma, but I think in the other sense of that is what support are we providing to make sure it doesn't become a traumatic experience? Because at the end of the day, it's a system overload. But if we can catch it in the moment and say, hey, no, like you're okay, like this was just a bad experience, then it's not going to become trauma. But it's a continued system overload where your nervous system doesn't know what to do with it. And we're never brought back to that feeling of safety, right? Because we talk about like the stress response, even, it triggers our amygdala, which triggers our fight or flight, which instantly in that moment, now your brain is flooding your body with chemicals for fight or flight, but we're not actually fighting or flighting because we're not cavemen anymore, right?
Right.
We don't know what to
we're
do
not
with
fighting,
it.
flighting. We're doing algebra.
Right, we're doing
Doesn't
algebra, but
work.
now we're sitting in this, like all this energy, which is representing as anxiety now. And at the end of the day, your kid comes home and is like, hey, like I had this experience. If you're like, hey, like brush it off, like you're fine, you're still stuck with that energy, right? Versus the parent who's like, hey, no, like that sounded really hard. Let's talk about it. How did you feel? No, you're okay. Like it's just a bad experience. Maybe I give you a hug, maybe I comfort you. That kid's going to walk away and be like, oh, no, I am okay. They're going to go back to that relaxed state of, now I know I'm okay. My body knows I'm safe. My body knows everything's okay. And now I can relax again.
Okay, so we want to validate feelings. We want to give them a safe space. We want to let them know or even relate to them. I've been through that.
Absolutely. And it makes all the difference. And I think as kids, we recognize that. But I think when we grow up as parents, because we tend to have kids so much later, or we tend to forget about our own experiences, or we're so busy in our own life, we forget how important that really is. I know for me, coming from an Asian household, my parents were hard on me. It wasn't like this, of course I had a loving, nurturing family, but when it came to education, my parents were hard. Like, did you do your homework? How are you doing on your tests? I'm constantly monitoring my grades. There wasn't this like, oh, let's sit down and talk about how you're feeling. It's how are you doing in school? My conversations with my grandparents were, are you doing everything you can to prepare for college? What are your plans?
Right.
It's like, I'm in ninth grade. I don't know.
How did you deal with that in the ninth grade?
Oh, I had a lot of like anxiety. I felt like I had this pressure of like, I need to know what I need to do right now. Just coming from an Asian household, and I'm sure for many cultures, it's not only do I need to figure out what to do now, but it needs to be on the approved list of what is okay, what is going to get me stability and money, and like versus like joy and happiness, and like what am I passionate about? It was what is going to create stability and a good income for you.
But if we do that at too young of age, we squash a child's creativity. We squash their imagination, which is ultimately a strength, which is also ultimately leads to success.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then they get so overcome with that pressure that that's part of what creates that anxiety, right?
And so, for instance, let's take a scenario where a parent has gone through a major trauma and not processed it, sort of put it off to the side, focused on their kid. What might happen?
Oh, you might become, like there's so many scenarios, but like, so more often than not, I see these parents become like almost like helicopter parents. Like I never had that safety. So now I have to make sure no matter what, you're safe, and I need to have you in control because I was never in control of my situation. And so now everything about it, I need to control you. I need to make sure you're safe. I need to, like, it almost all gets projected onto them. All their fears, all those feelings that trauma left them with, their negative beliefs, it gets all projected onto this child or the children. And it makes a huge impact because they take that on.
Right.
Like that ends up coming out like, for kids, it's so much like depression and anxiety. And they already have all the pressures of like being a kid, making peer relationships, trying to survive essentially the grand scheme of high school, which we know as being high schoolers, like that's tough in itself, on top of your familiar pressures and having this parent with unresolved trauma who's just like constantly having you as a sounding board for all their stuff.
So a kid can wind up being their parent's therapist.
I hear it so often.
Because we need what we need.
Right.
If you have trauma, it has to come out.
Yes. And it will come out.
And so it's going to, first of all, it's going to wind up parentifying your kid, which is pretty much always
never a good thing.
Never a good thing. There's certain slam dunks in mental health.
Right.
To say some things never work. making your therapist your kid, putting your kid in the middle.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Usually I'll see like not only is your child your therapist, but they're also triangulated into your marriage.
And then it's just too much stress. It's just the wrong role for them to be playing.
Absolutely. At 16, at 17, at 12, 13, who can handle, like, we can barely handle that as adults. How are they expected to handle it as kids and teenagers who don't even have their life together?
So you were saying you kind of wind up with this helicopter or anxiety parenting.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like this awful thing happened to me. I experienced trauma, and
Mm-hmm.
now I'm going to keep you from it.
Exactly.
And so the trauma is still kind of running the show.
Oh, yeah. I think when you have unprocessed trauma, we forget really how much it affects us. And sometimes, especially when, we're not parents, we can put it on the back burner and kind of like function to the best of our ability. And we tend to think that's good enough. Like, we know we could do better, but it's good enough. I'm okay. But then we have kids and it's a whole different ballgame, because then all our stuff gets triggered, because like a lot of your trauma happened in your early adulthood, your childhood, and your teenage years. And at some point that child is going to reach that age. Right. And we know that, like, you become a parent and you think of these things, like, what is it going to be like? What is my kid going to be like as an adult? What is my kid's teenage years going to look like? And then you start thinking about your trauma, maybe even on a subconscious level. It all gets triggered. Right. And we forget that, it affects us mentally, it affects us physically. And then we as the helicopter parent, we're just trying to control and provide safety. But really, like, our kid is like, there must be something wrong in the world because my parent like doesn't trust me out in the world.
Tell us what kind of therapeutic approach you specialize in.
So my specialty is in doing EMDR, which is the eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. I really find it to be so effective in helping not just the emotional, the mental, but also the physical somatic reactions of trauma.
And from what I know about EMDR, you can go in and target certain memories, certain stressors.
Yeah, like, you don't have to share your whole life history. And I've had it where clients are like, I'm just not ready to talk about it, but I do want to process it. Okay, that's fine. We can work with that. I just need a small snippet, give me something to work with, but I don't need the entire thing.
And what's the difference between processing and talking?
So trauma often doesn't get processed correctly. It gets kind of stuck in your nervous system, essentially. And so what EMDR does is it allows us to tap into it and reprocess it in an awakened state, if that makes sense. It's not like hypnosis. You're completely conscious. You're completely aware of what's happening, but we allow you to reprocess this memory, and your brain really does the work. It's really quite phenomenal. And really what it does is it helps us to target the place where your traumatic memories are basically scattered and stuck in, and it helps us to process them into a healthy space, and to also deal with the somatic feelings and the negative belief that you ended up believing about yourself because of the traumatic memory.
So reprocessing, it's almost like it's a way to bring a more emotionally mature and functional narrative.
Yes. So like if you had a trauma happen when you were like 8 years old, you're kind of like that trauma is always going to feel like you're an 8-year-old. And you're going to have a 8-year-old response to it, versus we can help you look at it from an adult stage, where you are today, look at it rationally and say, oh, that wasn't my fault. I had no control over this situation. This did not mean I wasn't good enough.
And with EMDR, it actually takes.
Yes.
As opposed to talking ourselves into it, talking our kids into it.
Right.
No, it's not your fault. No, that's not a big deal.
And in talk therapy, that can be a very long time that it takes to get to that. In EMDR, that time is cut in half because we're doing the brain work attached to it. We're basically creating like new neural pathways to help you reform those memories with a new adult view of it, of realizing like, I'm not that child. I am successful. I can trust myself. I survived the world. How dangerous can it really be?
So it's like therapy without all the talk.
Therapy without all the talk, essentially.
With the results, which I'm sure is going to make a lot of people happy. And tell us about the importance of finding the right therapist, the therapist that specializes in your issues.
I say this all the time, even to my own clients when I first meet them. The most healing part about any therapy is finding the right therapist for you. That's so important because you want the person who has those specialties in those areas.
Let's say someone has trauma and they go to a therapist who is more of a generalist.
Honestly, sometimes you just end up re-traumatizing yourself. And then you don't want to do therapy anymore because now your nervous system is so constantly activated that you're like, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
I'm just feeling worse because you're just talking about it. Like, not everybody here is a trauma specialist where like, turns out this person has some severe trauma behind all these other things. Then what we'll do is I'll come in with the EMDR and I'll process the trauma. Right. And once I've processed the trauma and they're good to go, they can go back to their therapist and continue working on the other stuff, maybe to day-to-day functioning or even just coping skills or, whatever.
That's so Healing Solutions kind of has a collaborative, interdisciplinary.
Absolutely.
To me, that really needs to be the new wave of mental health.
Right. We as therapists can't expect ourselves to be like, okay, this is my specialty, but these other things come up and now I don't know what to do with it. I'm just going to ride the wave of it and hope for the best, which I think happens more often than maybe we'd like to admit.
It does.
Like if I have a client who ends up having an eating disorder, that is not my specialty. And that is one of those things that really need a specialty therapist. Well, luckily, we're lucky enough to have someone who deals with eating disorders. It's so important to have these ability to be so collaborative with each other. With some of my clients who are married and dealing with trauma, I end up sending them and suggesting marital counseling because it makes it hard for us to deal with the trauma because now we're dealing with something else. Yeah.
Right. It's sort of like, for instance, if I'm dealing with parents with co-parenting and they're clearly fighting, they're having trouble cooperating, we have to get through this before we can get to the parenting. And I know it's frustrating for parents or anyone when you come to therapy and we send you to more therapists. It's like we're all colluding together.
Right.
To get your business.
It absolutely feels overwhelming in the beginning. Right. Because now it's like I have to take my kids to therapy. I've got my own therapy. Now I have to go to marital counseling. But, like if you can ride it out, everybody's getting the attention they need. You guys are all getting the skills, not just on a personal level, but on a marital level, a family level. And you guys are going to work better as a unit.
And if we do it right, therapy can end.
Yeah.
How awesome is that? Over, done.
I tell my clients all the time, like the weirdest part about being a therapist is my job is constantly to put myself out of a job.
Right. And that's what good therapy is. Yes.
And sometimes, you people have this idea, like if I ignore it long enough, it's going to go away. It has to be faced. It has to be dealt with. We have to allow ourselves a safe space to process it.
Hanika, thank you so much. Unbelievably helpful.
Oh, it was really my pleasure. I'm so glad I got the opportunity to sit down and talk to you and be able to do this with you.
So a few points I want to hit. Hanika brought up the idea that as parents, we have the ability sometimes to take a situation that can develop into trauma and keep that trauma at bay. I never really thought of it that way. But sometimes the trauma begins when people are gaslit or invalidated for their feelings, or it really compounds the trauma. And we kind of know that, for instance, in a case of sexual abuse, when someone discloses their sexual abuse and they are not listened to or believed or discouraged from talking about it. But even in a situation like divorce, let's say a child is sad because their parents got divorced, and with good intentions, we jump in and say, no, mommy and daddy are going to be happier this way, and it's going to make you happier. That might be true in time. But for right now, the child is feeling torn apart or sad or scared, and we need to give them room to feel that way. A useful definition of mental health I often express is mental health is the ability to feel all your feelings in real time, because all your feelings and emotions are there for a reason. So we go to a funeral, we feel sad, and we have ice cream, and we feel pleasure. We go to an artistic movie with subtitles, we feel uncomfortable and inferior. Maybe it's just me. At the same time, we feel invigorated by the ability to educate ourselves. The more feelings and emotions we have, the more adaptable we are. At the same time, we don't want to ruminate in feelings. I don't want to feel sad today, and then 2 weeks later, I can't get out of bed. As parents, I think we're pretty good at guarding against rumination. We don't want our kids to be sitting in their feelings to the point that they can't do their daily activities and responsibility. But sometimes we're so diligent about that, we don't let them feel in the first place. And again, getting back to trauma needs to heal. Whatever grief, loss, fear that's occurred, we need to give them room. Also, this kind of jumped out at me when Hanika was talking about her childhood, and I'd love to know what you guys think of this. She kind of indicated her parents weren't really prioritizing her happiness or creativity. Now, we could say, well, I guess it worked. She sounds like a really intelligent, interesting person. She's got a career as a therapist. So, like don't blame the parents. And I get that. At the same time, a couple of things. First of all, when we discourage our children, the ramifications are always going to be a little more than we intend. For instance, discouraging a child often makes them feel discouraged. Even though our intention is to enlighten or protect, a question to ask yourself is, what's the emotional message here when I say, no, don't go into the music business. That's a bad idea to my child who's only, let's say, 15 years old. Probably something like, you can't do it. I mean, am I wrong? I realize that's not the intention. But if our children come to us excited about something and then we're discouraging, they might get discouraged to try other things or just get discouraged in general. And it's totally up to you. You might be like, you know what, dude, fuck it. My kid ain't going into no music business. I get it. I'm only suggesting consider the effects of that, the diminishing return of squashing that excitement. And remember, this relationship goes into adulthood. You could wind up one of these parents saying, why don't you call? Wait, give me a call every once in a while. The age-old question, why don't you call? Why do we not do things? Somehow I don't want to. And it might be because there's a tendency to feel judged or criticized. Again, consider the possible diminishing return. Our kids might do what they want anyway, and maybe we should just support them, especially, and this might be the line, if they're willing to do the work. My parents and I had some challenges when I was a stand-up comedian, but I was always willing to do the work. I was on stage every night. Now, if your child is not willing to do the work, different story, okay? And I am the first to say young people don't always have a good plan, and we're allowed to weigh in on that if they're going to, for instance, live in our house, or if they're going to, they get to an age where they're using our resources, and your 19-year-old says, no, dude, I'm playing video games 14 hours a day because I want to be a video programmer. So I'm working on my career. No, that we're allowed to have our rules and boundaries and consequences. So just to sum this up, we can guide them and we can have our boundaries. And there's all types of things we can do to not enable them and not let them indulge fantasies that truly are unrealistic because they're not doing the work. However, we might want to pause before telling our kids, who are, I know, believe it or not, their own individuals, exactly what to do with their life. And I'm not even judging that decision as a parent. I'm just saying consider the ramifications. Because they might go and become an animal trainer anyway, and on top of it, they won't call us. What's Danny doing? I don't know. I think he's like with the elephant in the chair or something. He might work for the circus. I don't know. He won't call me. On the other hand, if we let them figure it out for themselves, they'll call us. Maybe. And by the way, when I talk about music business, I'm just talking about anything that feels risky, that jacks up our anxiety and triggers us to try to control them. It could be inventing your own app. It could be whatever the kids are doing today. And another thing to consider, the classic job with benefits isn't what it used to be. Owning your own business, kind of doing your own thing, is a more viable option. It's a more normalized experience than it was when, say, we were teenagers. Okay, and before we wrap up, like I said, we're going to answer your questions. Once again, email me anytime at whatsayme43 whatsayme43@gmail.com. That's whatsayme43. Is that a good email? I don't know. Like, you open up the Gmail and I just had to think on my feet. Get it? What did I say? Whatsayme? Anyway. And guess what? I got my first email. Here we go. I am so excited. Dear Dan, that's me. You got a podcast. My 16-year-old son continues to disregard his curfew, but if I take away his car keys, I'm left driving him to school. What should I do? Should I take away his phone instead? Okay. Good question. Now, first of all, you can take away his car keys when he gets home from school. Like, we can customize these consequences to work for us. In other words, let him drive himself to school and home, and then yoink. Secondly, I would say stay away from the phone, because consequences work better with teens, like when the time meets the crime. Did I say that right? When the crime meets when the consequence makes sense, when it's an actual teaching moment. So your son goes out and violates his curfew with his vehicle, and then he's losing that very vehicle. Rather than, I know it's tempting to take away the phone because that really gets them where they live, but that lacks a certain respect and tends to trigger teenagers in a way that is going to make our life harder. Imagine at your job if there was some, I don't know, memos or what do people do at work? Paperwork that you were doing incorrectly. And this would prompt some kind of action or a consequence to remedy the situation. For instance, I'm sorry, Dan, we're going to have to demote you temporarily until you learn how to do this paperwork. Now, I wouldn't be happy, but I would understand and I would remain motivated. But let's say they said, now, Dan, you've been doing this paperwork incorrectly. So you know that coffee creamer you really like in the break room? You can't have that anymore until you learn how to do thorough work. Just because you figured out how to push my buttons and how to get my attention doesn't mean I'm going to be motivated now. I kind of feel disrespected, like you're treating me like a child. Time doesn't fit the crime. Another thing, short and time-sensitive consequences works better than open-ended. It's better to have an enforceable statement. For instance, you violated curfew tonight, so you don't get the car the following night. Boom, end of story. That's better than something open-ended and vague, like, you'll get your keys back when you learn how to be respectful. Like Trish said last episode, when teens lose all control, they don't care anymore. And that's when they start sneaking out. And you don't want that power struggle where they're like, okay, it's on, let's go. You can take my keys, you can't take my body as I sneak out the window. What are you going to do? Call the cops? Go for it. Short-term consequences do the trick. We just want to be effective. We don't want to take all the power. We want to disrupt them enough that they act differently the next time. There's nothing wrong with saying, okay, you were late tonight, you lose the car tomorrow. Whatever works. I'm so happy to answer any questions, and I hope I've answered this one sufficiently. Tune into the next episode. We're going to do something a little different. I'm going to interview Greg Behrendt, a friend of mine, author of He's Just Not That Into You. He's a comedian. He's a podcaster. And he's a very committed parent. We're going to talk about his ups and downs in his life and with parenting and reflect on it and kind of see what worked, what didn't work, and how we can learn from that. It's going to be a lot of fun. Join me, and I'll see you next time on What Did I Say?